For the last 70 years, the area that was formerly known as Palestine has continued to shrink, such that it's now about 10% of what it was years ago. Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Leila Sharif joins me in discussing Palestine, the current conditions of Palestinians, and how American citizens are supposed to be able to understand the conditions in that region. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Leila Sharif, to discuss Palestine and how Americans understand Palestine. Welcome, Dr. Sharif.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Dr. Sharif earned her PhD in Sociology and Ethnic Studies from the University of San Diego. In fact, she was the first Palestinian American to earn a PhD in Ethnic Studies, which is surprising by itself. Dr. Sharif teaches courses on race, empire, militarization, colonialism, food, and culture, and she's currently working on a book analyzing the politics of consumption by tracing the circulation of olive commodities from Palestine to the US, and then taking up questions of indigenous survival, neoliberalism, race, and gender. She asks, how is Palestine made palatable? How is Palestine made visible to Western consumers? And what is masked and revealed in this process? So I guess my first question would be maybe talk about how Palestine is made visible, but embedded in there is a question, why does Palestine have to revert to importing olives to become visible to the American public?
That's a great question. Thank you. First, I just want to say thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to discuss my work with you. And I also want to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Delaware, Eel River Tribe, Miami, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and Waya peoples. There are two issues really in response to that question. The first is the question of censorship of Palestinian scholarship and Palestinian activism. So most recently, for example, Donald Trump released an executive order in December of last year, which made it difficult to speak on issues on college campuses that critique the state of Israel. We've seen censorship play out in other ways as well. So for example, at my own university, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where I teach, we saw the infamous case of Steven Salaita, who was fired as a result of a tweet that was critiquing Israel's raid in the Gaza Strip. We've also seen in 2018 the firing of Mark Lamont Hill from CNN as a result of comments on CNN indicating that he supported Palestinian rights. We've seen character assassinations of Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar on the basis that they are very outspoken about Palestinian issues. So really the first issue is censorship. Well, why does this censorship exist? What is it about Palestine that is in such need of censorship? Why is this particular site so problematic? And that really goes to a specific history and set of geopolitical relationships. Most importantly, the United States and Israel have a special relationship. We in the United States pay Israel $3 billion in military aid per year. So in some ways, which amounts to more money than any single country has received since World War II. So as a result of that, we have a sort of de facto apartheid situation in Palestine at the same moment that Palestine has been so heavily censored in popular media and in news channels, at the same moment that it is being censored on college campuses, at this moment of an upsurge of sort of pro-Israeli rhetoric, primarily as illustrated by the most recent deal of the century, but a sort of history since 1948 of that sort of special relationship that has made it increasingly difficult to critique the state of Israel or to bring in Palestinian narratives and subjectivities without being criminalized for them.
Is it sufficient to have stories and memories to have a nation? Again, it's back to this question of to what extent. I may remember the land, or I may have stories about the olives, or I may have stories about my ancestors, but if there's nobody to go back to, like if I go to my childhood home that doesn't exist, there's nothing for me to go back to. So it's maybe it's a question that isn't possible to answer in a 20-minute conversation about what is a nation and how does a nation establish its rights. But it seems like a question of power, a question of authority, question of some ability to unleash social movements or some other force. Without that, it really does become a story, and it's something you can read to your kids to put them to sleep, but it's not something that appears on the world stage that can stop a behemoth like the United States.
Well, I would sort of think about it a different way. While stories tend to have a sort of tame cadence, when you say story, you think of something that is sort of depoliticized or exists outside of politics. However, when I talk about the olive tree, it comes up in multiple ways. There are stories, for example, that I hear from women who said that in 1948, when Israel, or at the time it was Europeans, came to take Palestine and to create a Jewish homeland called Israel, in historic Palestine, they came with bombs, with shells, with various kinds of airstrikes, and people would retreat into the olive groves. This idea that the olive trees were there to literally protect Palestinian women's bodies when they had to, for example, breastfeed or find a place where they could get away from the shelling in order to be able to provide sustenance for their children. But it also comes up in other ways, where, for example, we have a huge facility in the West Bank in Berqin, which is one of the largest Palestinian olive extraction factories that imports to, for example, companies like Dr. Bronner Company, which is a German Jewish family that immigrated to the United States and has deliberately decided to take on Palestinian or import Palestinian olive oil as part of their magic soaps in order to support Palestinian humanitarianism, Palestinian economic stability, and sovereignty. There's also another case of that are much smaller in scale and cases that are larger in scale. So smaller scale, for example, is Middle East Grocery and Bakery in Chicago, where a man named Hisham has a connection to where he comes from, which is a village called Arura village in Palestine, where they take their family's trees, they harvest them, and he, through his grocery store in Chicago, imports those products and sells them on shelves, stating that this olive oil is made in Palestine as opposed to made in Israel, which so much of our Palestinian commodities are branded as Israeli. So it's a refusal to be appropriated as well. To
the brands that are marketed as Israeli, do they do that out of economic necessity, that's the way they can actually distribute goods to the U.S. or to Europe? Because if they are labeled Palestinian, they create political responses?
It's true. So a lot of the products that are labeled as Palestinian came really as charity, through charity from Europe and from the United States in the early 2000s. And in other cases, it comes up as well. So for example, I went and during my ethnography, went to a facility called Sindiana. Sindiana is a women's cooperative in which they call them Arab women, but they're Palestinian women work alongside Israeli women through these women's cooperative initiatives that then export their olive oil to Lush Cosmetics, which is one of the largest retailers of vegan and vegetarian, if not the largest, of vegan and vegetarian cosmetics based out of the UK, with over 400, probably 500 at this point, stores worldwide. So in that case, those women live in the state of Israel. They're not in the Palestinian occupied territory. So I do see that there's a certain level of performing for the sort of notions of peace through economics. So we'll work with you, we'll give you our traditions, these harvesting practices that we've inherited from our ancestors that are 6,000 years old. We will use them and commodify them, but it also allows us to stay in our land so that it's still a Palestinian, perhaps village, perhaps cut off from greater Israel, but there's still a sort of sustaining practice in participating in these limited and conditional ways. But they do offer up moments of political organizing and strategizing in order for people to really decolonize, to be able to stay on their lands. Now, it's not perfect and it's not comprehensive. Right? It's incoherent. It happens in these various moments. So what I do is, in my work, I start with the harvest, and I pick the olive from the moment that it is harvested by Palestinian farmers, and trace its circulation to Sindiana, where it inevitably goes to Lush Cosmetics, to the Dr. Bronner Company, as well as other sites.
And how does this aid the Palestinian recognition to the American public? I mean, there's several questions that are percolating. One is, how does this resist colonialism? I live not far from here, and the Pokagons are, I think they're the only native nation that was not removed, but the way they've overcome their colonialism is by running casinos, and that doesn't exactly recapture their identity or their traditional culture. So I understand why Palestinian women within Israel would do this as a matter of economic survival, but I don't understand how it aids in expanding a discourse that was shut down with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions by some states saying it's illegal. I'm not quite grasping how this olive production and distribution opens that up. Does Dr. Bronner say these are from Palestinians? Does Lush say these are Palestinian?
Well, Lush says this is from an Arab-Israeli cooperative. Dr. Bronner does say this comes from olives harvested by Palestinians. In perhaps our most ambitious desires, it does not decolonize Palestine right away. However, when you tell the world, or when the world is made aware that the rhetoric is that there's no Palestine, but yet American consumers are buying products that are made in Palestine, it does a sort of thing to create a sense of presence. Now, it's limited and it's conditioned on capitalism and also through charities and other avenues as well, but it does something to make a claim that this particular land that is said to have vanished, that doesn't exist on that map, right, is actually one that is Palestinian. And in fact, it is through our ancient practices of harvesting that we maintain that sense of identity. Right, so it's not, as I said, it's not through a coherent scale. These folks are not necessarily in conversation with one another, but
there's different avenues of resistance. I think that's true historically in all colonial nations. It may be simply working slower, it may be resisting, it may be leaving like African slaves did in the Caribbean. They would just run versus finding some, temporary solution to be able to survive and maintain your culture, even while it is being colonialized.
Absolutely.
We've used this word quite often, and often you will hear the word apartheid in referring to Israel. Obviously, Israel or the Zionists in particular don't appreciate that term, but it evokes this idea that there's a segregated society, and you need, in South Africa, you would need passes to go from one, passports to go from one place to another. Could you talk a little bit about the apartheid or the segregated character of contemporary Israel and what they call Palestinian territories?
Right, absolutely. So Palestine is very similar to what are known as Bantustans in South Africa. In a sense, these are ethnic enclaves that are absolutely restricted. Basically,
That means you can't leave that area.
you cannot leave that
there's a
area.
Gate, there's a fence.
There is a whole bureaucracy of permissions. There are watchtowers, fences, the wall, this 8-meter tall wall, help funded by U.S. taxpayer money. There are institutions of policing that actually circulate to our own borders here in the United States. There are Israeli technologies tested on Palestinians first, same technologies that were used to dispel Black Lives Matter protesters, for example. But what it means is that your movement is not free. Your movement is absolutely restricted. Israel controls air, land, and sea. Gaza is also a unique situation in the sense that it is referred to as an open-air prison. It's the densest population in the entire world in this tiny, tiny strip of land, but it is completely restricted and cut off, such that if Palestinian farmers or fishermen, or fisher people, I should say, are to go out fishing beyond 6 nautical miles, they are effectively at risk of death by Israeli military. So it means that your movement is absolutely restricted. If you go to Palestine, there are 2 ways in. One is through Israel, which you have to have, if you're Palestinian, you don't have access to this airport because it's Israeli controlled. But as a US citizen, I was able to travel to Tel Aviv-Yafo airport and go into the West Bank, etc. Now, if you are Palestinian, you are virtually largely refugee population. You don't have papers or any indication that you're a citizen claimed by a particular state. So you kind of live in the borderlands. And that way is to go in through Jordan. The minute you enter, you are immediately surrounded by armed people. It is 12 hours of interrogations the last time I went there. It is lots of asking questions about what brings you here, where's your family from? And this is not the worst because I have the privileges of citizenship. So for the most part, it is such a level of restriction that it is considered a sort of suffocating kind of enclave that is very much similar, if not identical to, in some ways, the Bantustans of South Africa. There are also segregation. Segregation is something that exists in, for example, Palestinian capital, which is East Jerusalem, is claimed, which Donald Trump wants to give away to Israel. And then the West Jerusalem is the Israeli capital. So it's literally a segregated city. If you're a Palestinian, you need permission to go into the Israeli side. On the other side, you don't necessarily need the same amounts of permissions. But things like your license plate dictates what streets you're allowed to drive on, where you're allowed to walk. So Angela Davis, somebody that I really respect and admire, went to Palestine, and she had made this comment that Palestine was worse than Jim Crow because at least you could walk on the roads. You can't walk on roads. Palestinians have an infrastructure that is very delicate as a result of the occupation constantly having sort of these setbacks, roadblocks, and other forms where everything is sort of a state of precarity.
The other thing that seems to be true is that the resistance to this segregation or the resistance to this enclosure by Palestinians is immediately labeled, I don't know, as far as saying terrorist. The 2014 Israeli incursions or invasions into Gaza was based upon the idea that there were these tunnels and that the Hamas and others were. So but part of this is how is it possible for American citizens to know anything different short of taking a class with you or reading a book? Because in my own work, I found that the media generally will accept certain sources, accept certain frames, will accept certain descriptions of conditions in the Palestine, and it's really hard to not be kind of almost restricted in that way too.
Absolutely.
By the media reports. So how would an average citizen in the United States, short of reading Dr. Bronner's Bottle, understand what, I guess, the ethic or the justification for resistance within the Palestine areas that remain?
That's an excellent question. And this is also an unprecedented time in the sense that Palestine has become more mainstreamed as an issue as a result of social media and other kinds of political work that is getting wide dissemination. How do you say that word? Dissemination. So, for example, I really like this website that is made by an American journalist, and it's called ifamericans.knew.org. Basically, without adding judgment, it just presents the statistics and the data that show the discrepancy in U.S.'s treatment of Palestinians and U.S.'s relationship to Israel, but also facts on the ground. For example, within a particular incursion, Palestinians are being circulated as terrorists on various kinds of media, but you find that it offers facts about, well, what happened,
well,
right?
Even the map that we're talking about, to make the argument the Palestinians are attacking, and you see a map over 60 or 70 years where the
land is
territory
shrinking.
that's Palestinian would be, well, the attacks aren't going so well. Or, and I've also seen just pure graphs about the number of people, like the Gaza, when Israel went into Gaza, the number of people that were killed, that died as Israeli versus Palestinian, and there's multiple of those. So I don't know if you know Mint Press or if you know Mondoweiss. Both of them are websites that kind of give, I would say, an alternative view on events, and they have journalists on the ground in some cases. So.
I think that those are excellent news sites. Mondoweiss is specifically about the Palestine-Israel issue. Ma'an News Agency is also an excellent one. The Jewish Voices for Peace has a lot of public release statements that are incredibly helpful, good talking points for talking to friends. Ifamericans.org ifamericans.knew.org is a really good data site. But there's also a lot of work that's happening within the younger generations on social media, which is making Palestine, on the one hand, much more visible, but also in some ways kitschy to talk about. So hashtag culture has really created a platform for Palestinian youth to be able to speak on issues in conversation. One of the best examples of this happened during the Black Lives Matter protests following the murder of Mike Brown. And when folks took to the streets in order to protest Black Lives Matter, a gross understatement, that ended up becoming a huge coalition among various political organizing groups, student-led movements, youth movements, etc. The police department, which was trained by Israel, was using ammunition, including tear gas, bullets, etc., on the residents that were protesting in honor of Mike Brown's murder. And one thing that came of that was when Palestinian youth in Palestine started tweeting to the residents of Ferguson saying, "This is how you protect yourself when you are tear gassed. Take an onion and shove it up your nose in order to break up that carcinogenic gas so that you can breathe again. Don't move, don't drink water, don't run away from it, drink Coke," right? And other ways of protecting life that circulate through social media, which are very effective, that are happening. Sometimes the sort of academic spaces need to catch up.
Well, it's a long ways from olives to social media, and I have half a dozen other questions, and I'm sure that we could talk more. Unfortunately, our show has almost reached its limit. So, Dr. Laila Sharif, thank you for joining me today, and maybe we can have you back again.
I'd love that. Thank you.
That's all the time we have on our program. Again, thank you, Dr. Sharif, for joining me on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I will see you next time.